Family excluded me from a cruise and tried to cover it up, but this happened next and exposed their lies. Family vacations were a cornerstone of my upbringing. From road trips to national parks to renting a beach house for a week, they were the glue that kept us close. My parents took pride in these trips, often remarking how important it was to create memories together. For all their quirks, they seemed to genuinely value family time, which is why I was thrilled when they announced the biggest trip we'd ever taken, a family cruise to celebrate my dad's retirement. The announcement was met with excitement all around. My older brother Jason immediately started talking about the ports of call, while my younger sister Lily gushed over the idea of sunbathing by the pool. I could barely contain my enthusiasm. I'd never been on a cruise, and the idea of sailing to tropical destinations with my family sounded like a dream come true. As the planning began, the group chat came alive with buzz. Jason and Lily shared links to excursions, swimming with dolphins, zip-lining through rainforests, and snorkeling over coral reefs, while my mom sent updates about itineraries and onboard activities. I joined in eagerly, researching tips for first-time cruisers and even ordering a new set of luggage in preparation. But as the weeks passed, I noticed a glaring omission. I still hadn't received my ticket. At first, I didn't think much of it. My parents had taken charge of the bookings, and I assumed it was a minor oversight. Everyone else seemed to have their details sorted. Jason and Lily were picking cabin assignments and comparing meal plans, but I chalked it up to my parents being busy with coordinating such a large trip. Still, the absence of my confirmation email gnawed at me. I brought it up casually during a phone call with my mom, asking when I should expect to see the booking details. She brushed it off with a vague reassurance, telling me not to worry because everything was being handled. Her response didn't sit well with me, but I didn't push it. My family had a habit of procrastinating, and I figured it was just another instance of last-minute organization. As the cruise date crept closer, my unease grew. Jason and Lily were finalizing their plans, choosing their excursions, and sharing screenshots of their bookings, while I was still left in the dark. I asked my mom about it again, this time pressing for a clear answer. Her response was evasive, a string of half-hearted explanations about budget constraints and timing issues. And then the truth came out. In a phone call with my mom one evening, I pressed harder, unwilling to let her dodge the question again. That's when she finally admitted it. They hadn't bought me a ticket. Her tone was almost apologetic as she explained that they couldn't afford tickets for everyone and had decided to prioritize Jason and Lily. She tried to frame it as a practical decision, pointing out that Jason had a stressful job and Lily was in the middle of a challenging semester at school. They needed this more, she said, as if that somehow justified excluding me. Her words hit me like a slap in the face. I felt a wave of emotions, shock, anger, humiliation, but mostly hurt. This wasn't just a simple mistake or an oversight. It was a deliberate decision, one that sent a clear message about where I stood in the family's priorities. When I confronted her, her justifications only made it worse. She mentioned that I was more independent and didn't seem as excited about the trip as Jason and Lily. These were flimsy excuses, ones that did little to mask the real issue. They had chosen to leave me out. My dad tried to step in and smooth things over, suggesting that I could still join them if I bought my own ticket. The suggestion stung even more. It wasn't just about the money, though I couldn't exactly afford to drop that kind of cash on short notice. It was about the principle. They had planned this entire trip, booked tickets for everyone else, and hadn't even bothered to tell me until I forced the issue. I spent the next few days stewing over the situation. Part of me wanted to go along with it, to buy my own ticket and pretend everything was fine. But the more I thought about it, the angrier I became. Why should I spend my hard-earned money to join a trip I wasn't even considered important enough to be included in? The family group chat, which had once been a flurry of excitement, now felt like salt in the wound. Jason and Lily continued to gush about their plans, oblivious to the fact that I wasn't part of them. My mom sent updates about packing lists and reminders about boarding times, acting as though everything was normal. Finally, I made my decision. The night before the cruise, I called my parents and told them I wouldn't be going. I kept it short and, to the point, I didn't owe them a detailed explanation. I simply said that I had other plans and wished them a good trip. Their reactions were a mix of surprise and disappointment. My mom sounded taken aback, almost as if she hadn't expected me to stand my ground. My dad was more understanding but still tried to convince me to reconsider, repeating his offer to help coordinate my ticket if I changed my mind. Jason and Lily, still clueless about the real reason behind my decision, bombarded me with texts asking why I wasn't coming. I ignored them. The next morning, while my family was boarding the cruise ship, I was packing a bag for a solo getaway I had quietly planned as a backup. I booked a cozy cabin at a mountain lodge, miles away from the drama, and spent the week hiking, reading, and enjoying the peace and quiet. But as I settled into my retreat, my phone buzzed with the first of many missed calls. My absence, it seemed, had sent shockwaves through my family, and they weren't about to let it slide. The silence I had hoped for after leaving the family group chat was short-lived. Barely a day into their cruise, my phone started buzzing incessantly. Missed calls from my parents, Jason, and Lily piled up one after another, accompanied by texts that ranged from confusion to outright frustration. I turned my phone to silent, but curiosity got the better of me, and I eventually skimmed through their messages. Jason's texts were mostly annoyed questions, asking why I hadn't told him I wasn't coming. Lily's messages had a sharper edge, accusing me of being petty and selfish for skipping out last minute. My parents, as expected, had a mix of disappointment and guilt-tripping, with my mom asking if I realized how much I was hurting the family by not being there. But I didn't respond to any of them. Instead, I leaned into the solitude of my mountain retreat. The cabin was perfect, small but cozy, tucked away in a grove of towering pines. The air was crisp, the kind that fills your lungs and makes you feel alive, and the trails nearby were quiet, offering me the peace I desperately needed. While my family was sailing through tropical waters, I spent my mornings hiking and my afternoons curled up by the fireplace with a good book. The contrast couldn't have been starker, and for the first time in weeks, I felt genuinely content. But the serenity didn't last. By the third day, my family's attempts to reach me had escalated. My mom left voicemails that grew increasingly frantic, begging me to call her back and explain myself. My dad sent a long-winded email outlining how much effort had gone into planning the trip and expressing his disappointment in my decision. Even Jason, who rarely cared about anything outside his own sphere, chimed in with a curt message. "This is ridiculous. Call Mom before she loses it." It was clear that my absence wasn't just an inconvenience, it was causing a ripple effect. My parents had likely spent the first few days fielding questions from extended family members on board, who were undoubtedly asking why I wasn't there. The idea of my mom squirming under that spotlight gave me a small sense of satisfaction, but it also left me wondering how much longer they'd keep up the charade. Then came the unexpected twist. On the fourth day, I received an email from an unknown sender with a subject line that immediately caught my attention. "Something you should know." Curiosity piqued. I opened the email and found a message from a distant cousin, Erin. She wasn't someone I was particularly close to, just another face at holiday gatherings and occasional family events, but what she wrote sent my heart racing. In the email, Erin apologized for not reaching out sooner and explained that she'd overheard a conversation between my parents and another relative during the cruise. According to her, my parents had admitted they'd deliberately excluded me from the trip because they couldn't justify the expense of another ticket. But that wasn't the worst part. Erin said that while my parents claimed it was a financial decision, they had also made comments about how I was less involved in family matters compared to Jason and Lily. They apparently felt that I didn't need the vacation as much as my siblings did because I was more self-sufficient and had my own life. The email hit me like a punch to the gut. I'd suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed by someone else was a different kind of pain. My parents hadn't just left me out of the trip. They'd rationalized it by deciding I didn't matter as much. What stung even more was Erin's closing paragraph. She mentioned that my absence had become a topic of gossip among the extended family on board, with some relatives speculating that I'd chosen not to come because I was being difficult or dramatic. She said she felt compelled to set the record straight, but wasn't sure how to approach it without causing more drama. I stared at the email for what felt like an eternity, torn between anger and resignation. My family's actions had always leaned toward favoritism, but this was a new low. Not only had they excluded me, but they'd also spun a narrative to make me look like the bad guy. I decided I couldn't let it slide. Taking a deep breath, I replied to Erin's email, thanking her for letting me know and assuring her she didn't need to get involved further. Then I drafted a message to my parents, not an angry outburst, but a concise and pointed statement. In it, I acknowledged their decision to exclude me and made it clear that I was aware of the reasoning behind it. I told them that while I wasn't surprised, I was deeply hurt by their actions and the way they'd chosen to frame the situation to others. I ended the email by stating that I didn't plan to engage further during their trip and that we could discuss it once they were back. Hitting send felt both empowering and exhausting. Over the next few days, I resisted the urge to check my phone, focusing instead on the beauty around me. I spent my evenings journaling, reflecting on how much energy I'd wasted trying to meet expectations that clearly weren't reciprocated. But even in my solitude, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of a larger reckoning. After sending the email to my parents, I tried to shift my focus back to my retreat. The cabin offered everything I needed, a sanctuary where I could reflect and recharge without the noise of family drama. But despite my best efforts, I couldn't shake the feeling that the situation was far from over. The silence didn't last long. A few days later, I received an email from my dad. His tone was carefully measured, but the underlying defensiveness was unmistakable. He began by apologizing if I felt hurt by the situation, the kind of non-apology that did nothing to address the core issue. He reiterated their claim that finances had been the main factor in their decision, sidestepping any acknowledgement of the favoritism Erin's email had exposed. What stood out most, however, was how he framed their reasoning. He said they had to prioritize Jason and Lily because of their greater needs at this point in their lives. Jason, he wrote, was under immense pressure at work, while Lily was still finding her footing as a young adult. The subtext was clear. I was the one expected to understand, to rise above because I was the one who supposedly needed less. I didn't respond. Instead, I forwarded the email to Erin with a short note thanking her for the heads up. If my parents were trying to rewrite the narrative, I wanted someone else to know the truth. Erin replied almost immediately, her tone sympathetic but tinged with her own frustration. She shared that the whispers about my absence had grown louder among the extended family on board. Apparently, my mom had taken it upon herself to explain my decision not to come, spinning a tale of last-minute cold feet and vague excuses about scheduling conflicts. It was a blatant lie, but it was clear she was trying to save face. What Erin said next, however, caught me off guard. She mentioned that during a casual conversation with my aunt, my mom had let slip that she and my dad had used a portion of the money budgeted for the trip to help Jason with a down payment on a new car. It wasn't public knowledge. My mom had shared it in confidence, but Erin had pieced it together from overheard snippets. The realization hit me hard. While I'd been led to believe the exclusion was purely about budgeting constraints, it was now clear that the decision had been influenced by yet another act of favoritism. My parents had chosen to prioritize Jason's car over my inclusion in a family trip, and they'd gone to great lengths to cover it up. The betrayal felt even deeper now. It wasn't just that they'd left me out. It was that they'd actively chosen to funnel resources elsewhere while expecting me to quietly accept my exclusion. That evening, I sat in front of my laptop, trying to decide what to do. A part of me wanted to confront my parents immediately, to demand answers and force them to acknowledge the truth. But another part of me, one that had grown tired of the endless cycle of conflict, felt it wasn't worth the energy. Instead, I channeled my frustration into a longer email, one that wasn't just about the cruise, but about the broader pattern of behavior that had defined my relationship with my parents for years. I wrote about the favoritism I'd observed growing up, the way Jason and Lily were often coddled while I was expected to shoulder more responsibility. I pointed out the emotional toll of being treated as the self-sufficient one, as though my independence meant I didn't deserve the same consideration or support. But I didn't stop there. I also addressed their attempts to spin the situation to the extended family, calling out the lies my mom had told about why I wasn't on the trip. I made it clear that I was aware of the truth, not just about the cruise but about the car, and that their actions had permanently altered how I viewed our relationship. Hitting send felt like a release. Over the next few days, the fallout continued to unfold. Aaron kept me updated on the mood aboard the cruise ship, where tensions were apparently running high. My mom had grown increasingly defensive, snapping at relatives who asked about me, while my dad tried to smooth things over with his usual placating charm. Jason, oblivious as ever, continued to enjoy himself, posting pictures of lavish dinners and tropical excursions on social media. Lily, meanwhile, had joined my mom in spreading their version of events, painting me as the unreasonable sibling who had chosen to cause a scene by not showing up. But the real surprise came when I received a message from an unexpected source, one of my uncles, who had been relatively quiet throughout the drama. In his message, he said he'd been keeping an eye on the situation and had started to notice patterns in how my parents treated me compared to Jason and Lily. He admitted he hadn't paid much attention before, but that hearing about my exclusion from the trip had opened his eyes. What he said next floored me. He offered to help. Not just with navigating the current situation, but with creating some distance from the family dynamic that had caused me so much pain. He said he'd experienced something similar growing up and wanted to support me in whatever way I needed, whether that meant listening, providing advice, or simply validating my feelings. For the first time in days, I felt a glimmer of hope. The fallout from the cruise continued to ripple through my family, each new revelation adding another layer to the mess they'd created. Aaron's updates painted a vivid picture of how quickly things had spiraled aboard the ship. My mom, who had always prided herself on keeping the family's image pristine, was visibly unraveling under the weight of her own lies. The whispers about the car down payment had spread faster than she anticipated. What began as a slip from my aunt over dinner quickly became the dominant topic of conversation among the extended family. For the first time, my parents weren't in control of the narrative. The realization that their favoritism toward Jason wasn't just obvious to me, but now to everyone, was clearly eating away at my mom. Aaron described the tension on board as almost palpable. My mom grew increasingly defensive, snapping at relatives who brought up my absence and retreating to her cabin whenever the conversations got too pointed. My dad, meanwhile, seemed to spend most of his time trying to mediate, stepping in with half-hearted attempts to smooth things over. Jason and Lily, predictably, seemed oblivious to the chaos they'd helped create. Jason spent his days lounging by the pool and posting pictures of extravagant meals on social media, while Lily leaned into her usual role of playing the victim. She told anyone who would listen that I had chosen to cause drama by skipping the trip, conveniently ignoring the fact that I'd been excluded in the first place. When the cruise ended, I thought the worst of the drama would finally die down. Instead, it came home with them. The emails and texts from my parents started almost immediately. My mom sent me several long-winded messages, each one a tangled mix of excuses, justifications, and attempts to guilt me into letting things go. She claimed the decision to exclude me had been purely financial and insisted that I was reading too much into it. One particular email stood out for its sheer audacity. In it, my mom wrote that I was being unfair by holding the cruise against them when they had always done their best for the family. She listed off past vacations we'd taken together as though they somehow negated the hurt caused by this latest betrayal. It was clear she wasn't apologizing, she was defending herself. Jason and Lily weren't any better. Jason sent me a curt text accusing me of being petty and telling me to get over it. Lily's messages were more passive-aggressive, peppered with phrases like "family should stick together," and "it's sad when people create drama for no reason." I ignored all of them. The surprise came from my dad. Unlike my mom, whose emails were little more than self-serving monologues, my dad's messages carried a different tone. He admitted, for the first time, that the situation had been mishandled. He even confessed that the financial excuse wasn't entirely truthful. In one particularly candid email, he explained that my mom had pushed hard to prioritize Jason and Lily, arguing that they needed the trip more than I did. He admitted that he had gone along with it, not because he agreed, but because he didn't want to create conflict. His words were both validating and infuriating. On the one hand, it felt good to have my suspicions confirmed. On the other, it was maddening to realize how easily he had dismissed my feelings to avoid rocking the boat. The revelations about the car down payment were the final straw. Aaron's confirmation that my parents had diverted money to help Jason buy a new car was a punch to the gut. It wasn't just about the cruise anymore. It was about years of favoritism, years of being expected to shoulder more responsibility while Jason and Lily were coddled and indulged. I spent days reflecting on everything that had happened. The patterns were too clear to ignore. My parents had always expected me to be the self-sufficient one, the child who didn't need as much attention or support. They had used my independence as an excuse to prioritize Jason and Lily, all while expecting me to quietly accept their decisions without complaint. But I wasn't willing to play that role anymore. I decided to write a letter to my parents. Not an email, not a text, a physical, handwritten letter that would force them to sit down and confront what I had to say. In the letter, I poured out everything I'd been holding in for years. I wrote about the hurt caused by their favoritism, the emotional toll of always being expected to step aside for Jason and Lily, and the way their actions during the cruise had cemented my feelings of exclusion. I didn't sugarcoat anything. I told them how betrayed I felt when I learned about the car down payment, how humiliating it was to have my absence become the subject of gossip among extended family, and how exhausting it was to always be the one expected to rise above for the sake of keeping the peace. But I didn't write the letter to lash out or vent my anger. My goal was to set boundaries, to make it clear that I couldn't continue the relationship as it was. The final part of the letter was the hardest to write. I told them that I needed space, real space, to process everything that had happened and decide what kind of relationship, if any, I wanted to have with them moving forward. I emphasized that this wasn't about punishing them, but about protecting myself. I mailed the letter the next morning, feeling a mix of relief and apprehension. As I waited for their response, I turned my focus inward. I spent my days journaling, reflecting on what I wanted my life to look like moving forward. For so long, I had let my family's dynamics dictate my emotions, but for the first time, I felt like I was taking control of my own narrative. The silence that followed was deafening. Days turned into weeks with no response from my parents. Jason and Lily continued their passive-aggressive posts on social media, but the messages from my parents had stopped entirely. At first, I wondered if they were simply processing what I'd written. But as the silence dragged on, I began to suspect they were avoiding the issue altogether. What I didn't know was that the real fallout was just beginning. The silence after I sent my letter stretched on for weeks. My parents, who had always been quick to reassert control in moments of conflict, seemed to have no strategy this time. The usual barrage of calls, emails, and guilt-laden messages had stopped completely, leaving me with the unfamiliar sensation of having the last word. At first, the quiet was unsettling. I found myself checking my email out of habit, expecting another round of justifications or passive-aggressive remarks. But as the days turned into weeks, I realized how much lighter I felt without the constant pressure of their voices in my life. Jason and Lily, predictably, filled the void left by my parents. Jason sent sporadic texts, all dripping with frustration and condescension. He alternated between chastising me for blowing things out of proportion and suggesting I grow up and stop creating drama. Lily, true to form, leaned into her performative victimhood, posting cryptic messages on social media about family betrayal and the importance of forgiveness. I ignored all of it. Instead, I focused on the peace I had carved out for myself. For the first time in years, I felt in control of my own narrative. I spent my days hiking, journaling, and reconnecting with friends who had always been my real support system. Slowly, the wounds my family had inflicted began to scab over. But the quiet didn't last forever. One afternoon, my phone buzzed with a call from Erin. Her updates about the family drama had become a comforting routine, a way to stay informed without re-entering the chaos myself. This time, though, her tone was different, more serious, almost hesitant. "What's going on?" I asked, bracing myself for whatever revelation she was about to share. Erin explained that during a recent family gathering, my aunt, the the same one who had accidentally exposed the car down payment, had directly confronted my parents. Apparently, my letter had sparked more conversations among the extended family than I realized. My absence from the cruise had been a topic of quiet speculation, but my parents' behavior since then had made it impossible for them to keep their story straight. At the gathering, my aunt had openly called out my mom, challenging her narrative about why I wasn't on the trip. She pointed out the favoritism and asked why my parents had prioritized Jason's car over my inclusion. Other relatives, emboldened by her candor, began chiming in, sharing their own observations of how differently I'd been treated over the years. Erin described the scene as tense and chaotic. My mom, caught off guard, had tried to deflect, insisting that the situation had been misunderstood. But the relatives weren't buying it. Even my dad, who usually played the role of peacekeeper, remained uncharacteristically quiet. The confrontation, Erin explained, had left lasting cracks in the family's carefully constructed facade. Relatives who had once dismissed my feelings as overreactions were now questioning their own assumptions. Some reached out to Erin directly, asking for her perspective on what had happened. Hearing this was both validating and bittersweet. On one hand, it felt good to know that others were finally seeing the truth. On the other, it was painful to realize how long it had taken for them to acknowledge what I had been living with for years. Then, days after Erin's call, I received a package in the mail. It was from my parents. Inside was a handwritten letter from my dad and a shorter note from my mom. My dad's letter was surprisingly introspective, acknowledging the patterns I had pointed out in my letter and admitting his own role in enabling them. He wrote about how he had often gone along with decisions he knew were unfair to avoid conflict, and he expressed regret for not standing up for me more. While his words didn't erase the pain, they felt genuine, a small but meaningful step toward accountability. My mom's note, in contrast, was brief and defensive. She stopped short of apologizing, writing only that she was trying to understand my perspective and hoped we could put this behind us. It was clear that her focus was less on repairing the relationship and more on preserving appearances. For days, I wrestled with how to respond. I ultimately chose to reply only to my dad. In my email, I thanked him for his honesty and expressed hope that we could rebuild our relationship over time. I made it clear, however, that this would require consistent effort on his part and a willingness to address the patterns that had caused so much harm. With my mom, I decided to maintain my distance. Her lack of accountability and refusal to engage meaningfully left little room for progress, and I wasn't willing to reopen old wounds just to make her feel better. As the dust began to settle, I focused on the future. For so long, my identity had been tied to the role my family had cast me in, the self-sufficient one, the peacekeeper, the child who didn't need as much. Stepping away from that dynamic was liberating, but it also required me to redefine who I was outside of their expectations. The final twist came weeks later when Erin shared one last update. She told me that my dad had quietly started to pull away from the family drama. He was spending less time placating my mom and more time pursuing his own hobbies and interests. While he hadn't made any grand declarations, it seemed clear that my letter had pushed him to reevaluate not just his relationship with me, but his role in the family dynamic as a whole. As for my mom, Jason, and Lily, they continued as they always had, clinging to their version of events and avoiding any real introspection. But I no longer felt the need to change their perspective. For the first time in years, I felt truly at peace. The experience had taught me invaluable lessons about boundaries, self-worth, and the importance of choosing peace over chaos. Family, I realized, isn't defined by blood or shared history. It's defined by respect, accountability, and mutual support. And sometimes, the most loving thing you can do for yourself is to walk away.